Good evening. Let's start tonight, show off, talking a little bit about Odessa. Odessa, an oblast in the southwest of Ukraine, appears to have paid the price for the Ukrainian drone attacks on the Kerch Bridge yesterday. Yesterday, we saw an attack on the car-carrying span of the Kerch Bridge. The Kerch Bridge connects Russia to Crimea, and this is the second attack on the Kerch Bridge during this conflict. One occurred last year. That was a far more substantial attack. And that attack, allegedly carried out by a truck bomb, destroyed one of the spans of the car-carrying span of the bridge, and then also damaged the train carrying side of the bridge. This time, the attack seems to have been performed by aquatic and marine drones. I've seen a number of reports today speculating as to exactly what the craft may have been, ranging from what effectively looked like a large jet ski, which is a remote-controlled jet ski with the same sort of power the jet ski has. If you've ever ridden on one or seen one ridden by a professional, they're powerful machines. They have high speed across the water. The larger ones can certainly accommodate 2 or 3 full-grown people, so the thought of putting perhaps up to a 500-kilogram warhead on one of these, I think, would certainly be possible. There are also reports of possibly a British torpedo type robot, a REMUS 600, may have been involved. There have been a number of reports indicating that for some reason that British intelligence agencies may have been involved. Now, I can't corroborate this at the moment. This is just some of the reporting that I've seen coming out from some Telegram channels, some social media. I've also seen some reporting that there was an MQ-9 Reaper drone in the area at the time. Now, over the course of the conflict in Ukraine, the Americans have been flying Global Hawks and Reapers throughout the Black Sea. There was last year the incident where one of those, I think it was a Global Hawk drone, was caused to crash after a collision with a Russian fighter. You may have seen the footage where the Russian fighter was approaching it from behind and they were attempting to dump fuel. And then in a maneuver that was reminiscent of something from Top Gun, the Russian fighter approached so close that it managed to just barely kiss one of the rotors on the back of the drone, but that was enough to cause it to lose flight stability and it crashed into the Black Sea. There was a reduction in the amount of Global Hawk drones for a period of time after that, although recently there have been reports of them there again. One of the other craft that I've seen hypothesized as possibly being involved in the attack yesterday is a Ukrainian Navy, a second-generation long-range naval attack drone. This is what appears to be more of a speedboat-sized craft, but again, drone capability, no humans on board it, and able to be packed with explosives. So it does, though, appear that Odessa has paid the price for that attack. Over the course of today, there have been numerous reports over a number of hours of what appear to be missile and Geran Drone strikes on Odessa and Nikolaev. Odessa and the ports of Odessa open onto the Black Sea. Nikolaev is further up into the estuary area. Reports are that Kalibr missiles may have been used here. These are serious serious weapons. The Kalibr are there are some different versions of them. Some of them are subsonic. Some of them have a hypersonic phase, a sprint phase they call it, at the end of their approach to their target, which is activated and allows them to proceed at upwards of Mach 2.5 or Mach 3. So as to minimise the amount of time for air defence to be able to intercept them. They range in size from about 6.5 to 9 metres in length. They have a range of between 1,500 and 2,500 kilometres, with reports of a new version of the Kalibr being developed at the moment, which has a range of 4,500 kilometres. That's really quite amazing when you think about it, that something then can be controlled and be accurate. And as accurate as these are, the reported accuracy of the Kalibr is 2 to 3 meters. So after sending it 2,500 kilometers around the globe, it will hit its target within a 2 to 3 meter accuracy. And given the warhead that they carry and the explosive force that they have, 2 to 3 meters is effectively pinpoint accurate. They utilize the Russian equivalent of the GPS service, the GLONASS service, to be able to guide them and with such accuracy. Some of the strikes in Odessa are reported as having been on the Artsiz Airfield in Odessa. Now, this appears from some satellite pictures I saw to be an abandoned airfield. However, reporting was indicating that this is where the armed forces of the Ukraine have been storing some of their unmanned autonomous vehicles. So some of the drone aircraft have been stored here. Now, perhaps they are able to launch in a much smaller a much smaller distance and don't require well-maintained runways as things such as F-16s and more modern fighter jets do. On the topic of fighter jets, which I will cover in another report, but there was an announcement today of the US announcing that they would be sending some F-35s into the Middle East, a squadron of those, which I'll come back to in another report. But yes, interesting to hear F-35s being sent around the world. I wonder when we might hear of more of them being sent over to Europe. So, the Kerch Bridge, the attack happened. I just want to speculate a little bit on this and what the reason may have been. Given that this is the second attack on the Kerch Bridge, given that the Kerch Bridge extends for about 20 kilometres, it's not a particularly easy target to defend. That's a long span to defend. It's accessible via water, as we've seen. So you can have water-based attack, you can have a submersible attack, you can have missile attacks, you could have attacks as were done in the past where it was apparently a truck bomb driven across the bridge. So given that the attack yesterday damaged completely one section of the car-carrying bridge. Now, the car-carrying bridge has two sort of parallel sections. One of them was destroyed and dropped into the water. The other one has been dropped and dislocated slightly from its position. Now, there were some reports, confusing reports, written in Russian, and I had some machine translation of them, which weren't particularly easy to decipher, but seemed to indicate that some traffic was perhaps moving across that one remaining span. Now, I don't know if that's because the Russians have been able to get in there and actually reseat it and replace it, or if they have built some just temporary ramp to allow traffic to move. I don't know. We'll find out more about that. Or it may be that the entire car-carrying bridge at the moment is unable to be used. There has been some reports of Google traffic maps showing heavy traffic flows going into the Kerch Bridge and heavy traffic flows coming out of the Crimean Peninsula into the area of Russia. So clearly traffic is being diverted out through the areas of, out of Crimea up into the very southern parts of Donetsk and Zaporozhye region, and going up through that area that's being now occupied by the Russian forces in what was Ukraine. So traffic has certainly been impacted, but interestingly, the attack seemed to occur underneath the car-carrying bridge and not under the one that carries trains. So in terms of impacting Russian logistics and being able to have an impact upon the amount of heavy equipment and fuel and ammunition that Russia would be using the Kerch Bridge for to push up through and into Crimea, the impact would be relatively small. It's inconvenient. It's a PR problem for Putin, but it's not actually had a major impact on the ability to continue supplies. So the train line, there were video reports of the train operating just a few hours afterwards. So the train spans of the bridge were not damaged. So this leads me to think, given that yesterday was when the Black Sea grain deal was expiring, was this perhaps a threat or a warning? Now, again, I can't corroborate this, so I'm just speculating here. But was this perhaps something to back up Antony Blinken's sort of statements and threats that there would be repercussions to the Russians? Perhaps was this attack done to disrupt and indicate that the West could reach out and could destroy the bridge if they wanted to, but haven't done that just yet, but instead have given a warning to President Putin to say, if you don't extend the grain deal, then we can damage this bridge, and we could do it. And my thoughts are that they could. If one drone was able to get there yesterday, then it's conceivable that 3 or 4 of those drones could have got there, and the attack could have been much larger. Now, I'm not on the ground, so I can't confirm that. Perhaps there were many more drones involved in the attack, and the bulk of them were stopped, and this was a lucky one that made it through. And attacking the Kerch Bridge isn't as easy as I'm making it out. And I'm not suggesting that it's an easy task to do. I'm just saying that if the US and the Ukraine have twice been able to attack the bridge, and they were able to attack it yesterday, and be able to disable at least one of the carriageways on the car-carrying bridge, it makes you wonder if they had really wanted to destroy the bridge, could they not have done that yesterday? And if they were able to do that and hadn't wanted to do it yesterday, so I'm making a big assumption here, but if they hadn't, then perhaps this was a warning or a threat of what would come. And I'm linking that to the timing of the Black Sea grain deal completing. Now, the Black Sea grain deal, I mean, what is the big deal with that? It's interesting. Reportedly, a while ago I was looking at this, and then it was suggesting that 60% of the grain that was travelling from Ukraine under this agreement, which was brokered by Turkey to allow Russian and Ukrainian grain and shipments to proceed out of the ports of Odessa and from Russian ports through the Black Sea, through Turkey and the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles, that over 60% of that would be proceeding to the developing nations. Now, in some reporting I've just seen recently, it appears that maybe not that full 60% is reaching the developing nations, and perhaps more than 40% of that is actually going to developed nations. So if we think about the West's position here, at present, Russia is the largest global producer and exporter of wheat, and by a considerable margin. They are a big exporter of wheat. Um, the EU is probably the second largest exporter. And then after that, Ukraine was probably in third position, although the last year or so has obviously caused that to decrease. If now the Ukrainian supply of wheat is stopped, well, effectively stopped anyhow, dramatically reduced, as taking the wheat out of Odessa, which has been until now relatively untouched in the dispute compared to other regions of Ukraine, it's been easy to take the grain from Odessa through the Black Sea. If that Black Sea option is now taken away, which is what Russians have now done by not extending the grain deal, they've effectively said that the Black Sea is no longer a safe place for transit of vessels, then the other option is for Ukraine to now push that out through its neighbouring nations. But that means it now needs to get that wheat out through the rest of Ukraine. And as we've seen in the last few days, really, perhaps since the Turkish deal to release the Azov commanders back to Ukraine, we have seen an uptick in the missile attacks and the bombings on Odessa. And there have also been reports that I've read by certain commentators that ultimately for Russia in this conflict, given that the Russian goals have changed as time has gone on from what was originally most likely more of a threat, a feint at Kiev to put pressure on Kiev to get Kiev to negotiate, which appeared to have worked. We have that reporting now that in February of 2022 and in March of 2022, Ukraine almost appears to have put pen to paper to agree with Russians to negotiate, which was stopped by Boris Johnson. With that having happened, and now that being taken away with Zelensky's change of heart and change of tact and agreement with Boris Johnson and the West to take NATO support, the Russian goals here have changed. And reports are indicating that ultimately, and this has come from people, well-respected people, military background and years of experience in sort of foreign relations, people like John Mearsheimer and others, who are suggesting that the Russians will now look to push to take the eastern oblasts of Ukraine under Russian control, and that would include Odessa. So we can probably expect to see more activity, increasing activity in the area of Odessa now that the Russians are no longer required to keep their hands off that area, to allow those ports to remain open. Taking Odessa as part of this special military operation would then effectively turn Ukraine into a rump state. They would be left without access to the Black Sea. They would effectively become landlocked if that were to become the new borders. However, you can see the appeal to Russia that if Russia were to take Odessa, they then control all of the northern part of the Black Sea, and their borders would effectively reach round, I think, until is it Romania? I have to check the map. But that would be of significant benefit to Russia, and it would also benefit the Russian desires to have what would be remaining of Ukraine be a neutral state. Russia would have full control over any ability for Ukraine to export, transfer, or take goods in through the Black Sea. And the import of goods through the Black Sea is also something, one of the points which the Russians are indicating is part of their concern over the Black Sea grain deal. So not only are they concerned that they have not been able to export their products as expected, along with the problems with the nitrogen pipeline, which was destroyed a couple of weeks or a month or so ago in the Kharkiv region, which was taking fertilizer, which the Russians were then going to be able to export. That was destroyed. But with the Russians being unable to do that, unable to move their products through due to problems relating to insurance. So while their freighters may have been able to take Russian products, perhaps get through the Bosphorus, they were then uninsured and unable to dock at ports. And this is something which would have required nations in the West to agree to honour the insurance. So they had issues like that. However, the Black Sea and the Odessa ports have for many, many years been known to be used for the movement and shipments of arms and weapons. Since Ukraine became independent from the Soviet Union in 1991, there's been a lot of trafficking of arms out of Ukraine to other areas around into Africa and things like that. You can go and you can Google that and find a lot of information on that. However, one of the reported concerns has been that during this conflict and during the Black Sea grain deal, that the UN inspectors who have been inspecting the tankers coming back into Ukraine, into the Odessa ports to reload, that perhaps their work hasn't been done to the standards that the Russians would have expected, and that there may have been hints of material contraband, perhaps weapons or munitions coming back into Ukraine via those tankers. Now, while again, I can't corroborate that, I'm not there on the ground, I haven't been able to be at the port and see this happening. It appears to be one of the other sticking points that the Russians are indicating has been part of the reason why they haven't trusted and felt as though that their needs in the grain deal have been honoured. So the grain deal appears to be off, and no indication at this stage of when that might renew. There have been some comments from Russian authorities that it could be renewed, but that they would need to see concrete evidence of the Russians, being able to utilise the agreement as they had expected and as they had agreed with the Turkish and the Ukrainians. Just one last thing on Crimea. I actually saw an episode of Brian Boletic's The New Atlas on YouTube today, and he mentioned something interesting, which was that in 2014, just after Russian forces had moved in and annexed Crimea, there was a referendum, and the referendum basically offered two options. It said, would you like Crimea to move under Russian control, or would you like Crimea to be given autonomy? And the reported results of the referendum were that about 81 to 83% of the Crimean population of just under 2 million people turned out to vote, and that of those votes, 97% of them voted for Russian rule. Now, there's been a lot of discussion about that. I mean, those numbers seem unbelievable. 83% turnout is amazing turnout in any sort of voting, and 97% agreement for a change of rulership, particularly in a country where there was something like, I think, 40% ethnic Tatars in there, and a large percent of ethnic Ukrainians in there. Seems unbelievable, and so I will grant you that. But what I found was interesting, very interesting, I thought, was that quite shortly after, immediately after, in the months following the referendum, there were a number of surveys conducted, and those surveys were conducted by pro-Western groups. Remember, this is in 2014. But the findings of those pro-Western groups were very surprising, and I'll post some links to them. But in some of these cases, what the findings indicate, or the questions that were asked, were you've just had this referendum. How accurate do you think the results were? How reflective of the Crimean people's wishes do you think the results of the referendum were? And surprisingly, the results of these surveys conducted by groups, let me just see here, some groups like the Gallup Group, an International Republican Institute, I've got some other ones up here, Pew Research. Pew Research, for example, they found that in Crimea, the question, should the government in Kiev recognise the results of the referendum in Crimea? When this question was asked in Ukraine, in the west of Ukraine, 11% said yes. The east of Ukraine, 40% said yes. Russian speakers, 61% said yes. That's when that question was asked in Ukraine. When the question was asked in Crimea itself, so this is asking the people of Crimea who have just voted in a referendum to accept Russian control. They were asked, should the government in Kiev recognise the results of the referendum in Crimea? In Crimea, it was an 88% response of yes. It was second only to Russia, where when the question was posed in Russia, Russians in Russia said that yes, 89% of them said yes. And there are a number of these reports, as I say, from Western countries, from Western surveying sources that indicate that this was something that Crimea should have done, and the Crimeans agreed with it. So I'm sure I'll cop a lot of flack for this, but what I'm doing here is just reporting on surveys done by pro-Western groups just after the referendum, which seem to indicate a strong support by the Crimean people for the outcome of the referendum. So I'm not trying to claim that the exact numbers are correct, that 97% did vote yes for Russia. But what I'm saying is that when the Crimean people were surveyed, not by Russian groups, but by Western, pro-Western surveying groups, that the responses were in the high 80s, that yes, Crimea is moving in the right direction, that yes, Kiev should honour this decision by Crimea to have Russian control. So I find that very interesting, particularly in the current situation, where there is talk about whether Crimea is Russian, whether Crimea is Crimean, whether Crimea is Ukrainian. Interestingly enough, I don't think enough emphasis or focus has perhaps been given to the decisions of the Crimean people themselves. So look, these reports, as I say, I'll post some links here. So have a look at them yourself and apply whatever level of skepticism you think is appropriate. I just thought it was a very interesting topic. All right. Thank you very much. If you've made it this far, thank you. Please subscribe if you haven't already. Post a like, tell your friends. I look forward to talking to you again soon.